Welcome, everyone. We're happy to see you and thank you for joining us today. Every year at Octane, we're excited to share stories from our customers that hopefully spur some ideas, inspiration, or maybe even some aha moments. So, today's session, we have a great guest speaker, Jason Nadeau, the Chief Digital Officer of Fidelity National Financial. And Jason is going to tell us a little bit about FNF's digital journey over the past year and their approach to something that he calls identity-centric user design. So I hope you all enjoy it. Please leave any questions or reactions in the chat, and we will get to those after the presentation. And with that, Jason, why don't we get started by you telling us a little bit about Fidelity National Financial and your digital journey over the past year?
Yeah, thanks, Christy, and thanks everybody for joining. I know you had lots of options to choose from today. I'm glad you decided to choose to listen to what we've done at Fidelity National Financial. So I thought I'd take just a few minutes and tell you a little bit about Fidelity National Financial, since we are not necessarily a household name, and to share with you a little bit about our company. So Fidelity National Financial, we are traded on the New York Stock Exchange under FNF, and we are a Fortune 500 company. We specialize in the real estate industry, specifically focus on title and title related services. And so what that means is it's really our job to look at advancing and expanding and protecting homeownership. So we're responsible for ensuring the safe and successful transfer of title. We are also in the escrow business, which means we hold a lot of the money and we transfer a lot of the money that gets transferred around during the real estate transaction. And as a result, we are at the center of a lot of transactions. And we have a lot of constituents that come together and want to participate in a real estate transaction. And it's that particular experience, that closing of a real estate transaction, those parties coming together and participating all together in a transaction, in the transfer of a home from one person to the next, is actually the digital journey that I want to share with you a little bit about. So let's go to the next slide and take a look at a little bit of background of what was in front of us from a journey standpoint. So Fidelity's digital challenge, if you will. So one of the things that's important to understand about real estate in the United States is real estate in the United States is a very complicated transaction. As any of you have ever bought and sold a home know, there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of participants that are involved. There's a lot of money that moves around. There's a lot of real estate fraud that happens, believe it or not. There's a lot of wire fraud. There's a lot of business email compromise, and there's a lot of theft that goes on. In our business, since we are a large player in the space, we have a lot of transactions that we manage. Close to 2 million homes are bought or sold through our platforms every year. Specifically, what that means is I wanted to give you some stats on what the landscape looks like that we were trying to move to a digital environment. So we have 400,000 new consumers every year that come to our digital platform. Those are buyers, those are sellers, those are real estate agents and mortgage brokers and home inspectors and appraisers and lots of different participants. Some of these participants, like you see 500,000 active real estate professionals on there, some of those participants, in fact, are participants that come back time and time again, and we do a lot of business with them, and so they're reoccurring customers. We have 400,000 consumers a month that may not be reoccurring customers, right? If you're buying or selling your home, this is not something you're doing every month. This is not something you're doing every week. This is something you're doing on average every 5 to 7 years. So you're engaging with a company like us to help transfer your property, but you're only doing so every couple years. We had 5 different transaction systems. We had 15 different portals. We have 20 different databases. And on the right-hand side there, one of the things that you see is a number of different brands. The reason I put those out there was to share with you, we are a company that has grown over the last 20 years through acquisition. And so we've acquired a lot of different brands, and we operate under a lot of different brands. And that's going to become very important as I talk to you a little bit more about our journey. But what we were looking to do was to figure out a way to move this entire process digital, keep it very secure, because we do have a lot of security challenges in our space, but do so in a way that's able to bring all these disparate parties together. And so when we started down the digital journey, we started looking at identity and started looking at services. So let's take a look at the next slide, Christy, and talk a little bit about how we got there. And a lot of companies, when they start thinking about moving to a digital model, when they start looking at exposing all the information and the data they have in their internal systems out to portals, out to websites, out through APIs, they immediately think about service-centric design. They think about service-oriented architecture. They might think about APIs and microservices and these different types of buzzwords that we've all heard about. And make no mistake, we definitely took that into account in our architecture and had a design that involved all of your traditional service centric design. But what we realized is, because of what I talked about on the other slide, the vast number of participants that we have, the fact that they're not reoccurring participants, right? You're not coming to Amazon every couple of days to buy something. You're coming to our service once every 7 years to interact, and you are playing a different role every time. We realized that we had to take a step back, and we needed to look at designing our entire digital journey based around identity. And so what this has really made us realize as an organization, that identity centric user design is so very critical and very important to the way we were operating. So what I'm going to do today is talk to you a little bit about what identity-centric user design means. And what we did, frankly, and obviously we're at the Okta conference, is we took the tools that were available to us from Okta, and we looked at establishing a wider understanding of identity than you would in a traditional system. And then we use that wider description of identity to help frame exactly what that meant for our systems. We use that identity and the design around that identity to help drive what services and what service process we really needed to take a look at. So what does that mean? What did that mean for us? So when you start thinking about identity, and when a lot of people look at identity, I think one of the things that they tend to look at is sort of what we've represented in here as the who are they. Are you Jason Nadeau at Fidelity? Are you jason.nadeau at fnf.com? What is your username? What is your password? Do I know that you are who you are? And do I know that you are who you are in the context of authenticating you to log into a system? Well, what we did was we said we need to take a step back, and we need to think a little bit bigger picture, and we need to think a little bit more about what does identity really mean? And more importantly, how is identity important in the design of the systems and in the way that you're looking at um, building out your user journeys and building out your digital experience? So first and foremost, who are you, right? When you're coming to our website, and I'm going to speak a lot in context of somebody coming to a web portal, but we have a number of different ways that customers come to us. They come to us through a portal, they come to us through mobile apps, they come to us through APIs that are integrated into banks, mortgage companies, real estate companies, appraisal companies, a number of different participants in the market space. So the first thing is who are you? Are you Jason? Are you Jason Nadeau? And are you who you really say you are, or is there a risk that you are impersonating somebody else's identity online? So first and foremost, how do we know who you are? Then the next thing we looked at was, how do you work? How do you like to operate? One of the unique things about real estate is real estate very much spans the gamut of user functionality. So when you're at a business and you've moved to a digital model, a lot of companies, when they think about moving to a digital model, they say, I want to take a process that was traditionally analog, or take a process that was traditionally paper, and I want to move it digital. I want to move it online. But they look at it as sort of an opt-in process. So I'm going to use banking as an example. So the bank that I bank with, they have online banking. They have a great online banking portal. They have online mobile apps and such, like a lot of the banks do. But I don't have to use that if I don't want to. If I want to stay 100% with my paper checks, my paper deposits, I can absolutely just go right into the bank, walk in and do that. Well, one thing that was unique about the title industry is buyers and sellers are brought to us to conduct their transactions. They're brought to us by the bank, or they're brought to us by the real estate agent. So customers are coming to us digital, but they haven't necessarily decided that they wanted to be digital. We're trying to push them into digital. So what we had to do is do what a lot of people do with user-centric design, and look at different personas. Look at that individual and try and understand, how are they coming in? How are they connecting to us? What type of device are they using? What do we know about them? Have they transacted business with us before? And try and understand what's their persona, how do they want to work, and how do we engage sort of micro experiences for them as a result of that. Then the next thing is what role do they play on the transaction? Really interesting thing about real estate is anybody who buys a home is eventually going to sell it. So anybody who's a buyer on one transaction turns around and becomes a seller on another transaction. And then they turn around and become a buyer on another transaction again. And real estate agents, if you're familiar with their model, sometimes they're representing somebody on the buy side, sometimes they're a buyer's agent, sometimes they're helping the consumer sell their home and they're a seller's agent. And then what data and information can they access, right? We live in a world where data privacy is paramount. We live in a world where we, in the mortgage and real estate space, we have a lot of private information about customers. We have a lot of financial information about customers. but we also, because our business is in the coordination business, we have to figure out how do we share that information with different participants on the transaction. So this is what we mean by identity-centric design. It wasn't just enough to know that Jason was coming in and that he put in the right password. We needed to know if Jason was coming in, is Jason really who he says he is? How does he like to work? What micro experiences we need to provide him? On this particular transaction, what role is he fulfilling? What is he doing on that transaction? And then on top of that, now what data and functions and services can they access? So we talked a little bit before about services architecture, but with identity-centric design, instead of taking a look at the different services we had available and taking a look at the data that we had available and surfacing it up through a bunch of APIs and then building a UI on top of it, what we said is this was the most critical piece for us in our digital journey, which is we need to figure out who are the people that are going to be engaging with us digitally. How are they going to work with us? What's their persona? How do they like to work? Which role are they going to have? What data should they be allowed to have? That data that they are allowed to have changes based upon their role on the transaction, changes based to their association with somebody else's role on the transaction. And then who are they? Or are they really who they say they are? Are they somebody else coming in and pretending to be them? So we put this in the center. And as a result, what we came up with is what I'm going to show you on the next slide here, which is we came up with the InHere Experience platform. And what we did with the InHere Experience platform is we rolled out an entire suite of digital technologies, but they are all built on top of this idea of the InHere ID, which I'm going to go into more detail here in a minute. But the InHere Experience platform is a way for individual consumers, buyers and sellers, real estate agent, mortgage brokers, and other types of participants in the real estate transaction to engage with us digitally. They can engage with us digitally from within their platforms through APIs, through mobile applications that you see here, through a mobile responsive website that you see here, through a mobile website itself. And what we did was we designed all of these technologies to be micro experiences, if you will. We changed and broke apart the different parts of a real estate transaction and said, based upon your identity, based upon who you are right now in this transaction, what role you're playing, who you are, how you're interacting, who your customer is, who your partner is, we are going to surface not only the correct data, but we're also going to surface the correct experience for you. One of the things is a little hard to see on this slide, and I apologize, but I'm just going to point it out, is if you look on the slide or on the screen, if you will, that's in the background there, and you see that it looks like there are two maps there. There's two transactions that somebody's working with, and one shows that it's in yellow. It has a yellow bar and a little yellow graphic in the corner, and the next one's in blue. What we have also done is we have used visual indicators like this in addition to driving the micro experiences that you talked about. The other thing this does is it changes brands dynamically. So what you're seeing right here on this slide is if they'd gone into that first transaction, we knew that they were a real estate agent representing the buyer who was working with one of our 40 brands, Chicago Title, who happens to have a gold and white color theme and a gold logo. So you can even see as we move throughout the InHere Experience platform based upon which one of our individual companies they're working with. And keep in mind, since you can have multiple parties on a transaction, we may actually be engaging with ourselves on a transaction, with one brand engaging with another brand within the transaction itself. So this idea of putting identity first and saying, who are you and what are you doing in this transaction? And then using it to drive everything you see in the app was really pretty critical to the way that we put it all in place. And let's take a look at what we did here with the InHere ID. So what we did with this InHere ID is this idea that as you move through the transaction, different participants come in and out of that transaction. And in addition to different participants coming in and out of that transaction, you're also fulfilling different roles. And as you fill those different roles, we needed to know a little bit more about you. We needed to increase our level of comfort that you are who you say you are. So to give you an idea here, we actually have 4 products within our InHere suite. And what we do is we start at the very beginning with something so cleverly named of Start in Here. And what Start in Here is an online digital experience just for the buyer and seller that you can see graphically represented down there. And what this does is when you're coming in to sell your home, you're coming in to buy your home, we're going to stop and we take you through an interactive process to gather information about you. This is where we start to set the stage. This is where we start to build your identity within the system. This is where we figure out who you are. This is where we start doing checks in the background to verify that you're really a person, that you're really who you say you are. And we gather a bunch of information about you and we use that to begin your journey digitally with us. We start your identity here in the transaction. We then really move into the next phase, which is the bread and butter of the InHere process. And for those of you that have ever bought and sold real estate, this is that frustrating part of the transaction where everything got kicked off and then it seems like nothing's happening for several weeks and you're frustrated waiting to move into your new home and you don't know what's going on. Well, what's going on now that you're able to work with our digital platform is you're able to see what's going on. You're able to see all the steps that are happening as we move your transaction forward. This is where different participants start coming in and out of the transaction. This is where sellers come in. This is where buyers come in. This is where you engage with a lender and you need to get your financing. This is where the seller's agent and the buyer's agent start negotiating on little details like the closing date. They start talking about things about how you're going to hand over keys and such. And we start updating more and more participants in the transaction on what's going on. This is, as you can see, kind of represented graphically here. This is where we start wanting to learn more and more about the parties in the transaction. We start expanding our identity scope of the people at this point in time in the transaction, because here's where we start sharing information. So now we start saying things like if the lender notifies that buyer that they need to bring an extra $5,000 to closing because their credit wasn't quite what they thought it was going to be, and our system needs to notify both the buyer and that buyer's agent that money's coming to closing and they need to bring a little bit more because of a credit issue. We need to make sure that our system knows that that's information that we can share with the buyer and that we can share with the buyer's agent, but not any information you'd want to be sharing with the seller or the seller's agent, for instance. So this is where we start getting a little bit more in scope. And then we get towards the end of the transaction. We get to the point now where you're coming along and you're looking at closing the transaction. And as you're looking at closing the transaction, now you're signing documents. Now you're committing to the transaction itself. You're committing to those loan payments. And for any of you that have ever been through the process, you have to notarize a bunch of documents. And as you would know, for you that have been through it, or if you ever notarized a document in general, you have to sit in front of a notary and you have to show them your ID, and then they stamp the document and prove it's you. Well, in almost 2/3 of the states in the country now, because of the pandemic, laws have been passed saying you no longer need to do that in person. You can now do that very much like we're having this conversation today. You can do it digitally. You can now show your ID online via camera. You can take a picture of it. You can scan it. You can sign documents digitally, and we can witness those transactions or we can notarize those transactions online. But of course, that means now that I'm interacting with you digitally online and I'm certifying that you are who you are, I've got to take things up even more of a notch. Now I'm making you show IDs. Now I'm making you show your identity and I'm making you answer questions about yourself out of wallet or knowledge-based authentication questions. So now I'm stepping up that identity even more, as you can see sort of graphically. And then at the very end, at the end of the transaction, everybody comes back together. We sign a few documents, and most importantly, money gets dispersed. This is a critical phase for us on the money gets dispersed stage because at Fidelity, given the number of transactions that we touch, we literally take in and disperse tens of billions of dollars a year, which means we are very much a target for wire fraud. We're very much a target for people trying to impersonate other participants in the transaction in order to get into that money stream. So at the end, we bring all the participants again to the table, we bring them together, and we do that final check of identity and do some verification with those lenders. So as you can see, the way our digital platform laid out and how we progressively expand the identity along the way, how very, very important it was for us to put identity first and foremost at the beginning of the transaction. And what I would tell you is, regardless of your industry, fraud from a digital standpoint, impersonation and other types of transactions is just growing. And so it is so very critical, in my opinion, that instead of stopping and working on your services, I would suggest you should spend a lot of time making sure you've really got identity, authorization, authentication, roles, all those types of pieces really, really sewn up well. And so the end result of all of this is what we call the InHere ID. And so the InHere ID was one identity for everybody within the transaction. It is a lifetime identity with us. So as you buy and sell homes, as you refi your transaction, as you take out home equity loans, we continue to know who you are. We continue to be able to let you interact with all of our participants, and you can interact across that entire spectrum. And we're able to, as we said, progressively advance your identity throughout the transaction. And by doing this, not only did we build the digital experience that I shared with you that we're very excited about, and we've had a lot of success with it, but more importantly, we're able to bridge what, as you saw, were 20 different systems that customers having to use, not only into one system, but also into one ID. So while we brought out the InHere platform, a number of our legacy platforms still exist. And the beautiful thing about going with a single ID that we built on top of an Okta tenant is it allows customers that maybe are still working with some of our legacy platforms, or maybe have not updated their APIs to work with our new platform. We went back and retrofit all of our previous systems into those Okta tenants so that your InHere ID for any participant in a transaction works across all of our systems and works within the InHere platform. And that's kind of the story I wanted to share, Christy, with the group and help them understand how I personally, and you can tell I feel very passionate about it, but I really believe that identity is so critical. Knowing who your customer is and what they want is really, I think, top of the pyramid of importance for building out a digital experience.
Yeah, Jason, I would say as someone who literally extended an offer on a property yesterday,
Right.
my experience seems really archaic to what you just described, which is just amazing. And, there's so many interesting aspects there about all the parties involved and the identity sort of moving with the user as they progress through the transaction. So if you were to look back, what would your experience have been, you think, if you didn't start with identity?
That's a great question, and what we discovered for sure, as we so originally we went down the journey, frankly, in this we started with this idea of identifying what type of data we had in our different systems and what type of services we were going to need, and we had started a bit down that API forward or services forward journey, and then we got introduced to Okta. We brought Okta to the table, and then we flipped and went back to this identity, and what we discovered is what our business people and our business technical folks thought were the important pieces of data and information to surface up through APIs didn't jive once we actually identified the user and what the user wanted. And once we started doing those overlapping circles we talked about and said, well, Christy, you're going to be a buyer right now, and you're going to be a buyer on a transaction. And by the way, your buyer's agent that's helping you find that property is also selling somebody else a home we're interacting with. We realized that we had actually started down a path that was going to make our APIs unusable because our APIs were not um, sliced in a manner that fit with the different identity uses. So actually, I think we probably would have done a lot more rework, and I think we would have painted ourselves a bit into a corner by not having sort of started with identity first. And we saw that in a few of the solutions we built, and now it's first and foremost every time, for sure.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And if you had to look back on the early stages of this journey and building out InHere ID, what were the capabilities or the aspects of identity that were most critical to you achieving your digital goals?
Yeah, that's also a good question. For us, it was really about coming up with you know, the whole idea behind Okta and other solutions too. I don't want to just turn this into an Okta commercial, although am a believer. Um, Identity in a cloud was so powerful us, and it probably wasn't the cloud that was powerful, Christy, as much as it was identity abstracted from the systems. And so looking back, I think that we had a very much an aha moment when we started saying, we have all these disparate systems, we have all these companies we've acquired, and we need all of these parties to be able to interact with these different systems. Once we started saying, we're going to take identity out and we're going to put it up here, you're going to put identity in the cloud. We're going to say, Jason, you're Jason, no matter which system you're interacting with. And we had a lot of discussions internally that were things like, oh, well, Jason or Christy, this system is really designed for a buyer's agent to do this, this, and this. And Jason's not always a buyer's agent, so we shouldn't have him in our system. And so we had coupled who you are with what you do so tightly that we actually made it difficult for our systems to be as agile as like. And once we pulled that out and started thinking differently and saying, you know, you're just a user, and what you want to do with the system needs to be different from who you are. And I know it sounds really strange, but once we did that, once we really pulled identity out of the systems themselves and said, as a system, your job is to do whatever processing functions you have. You don't really need to be in the identity storage business. It just really changed our design models a lot, and for the better, actually, made things easier. We had a call this very morning where we were talking about something, and one of our developers said, "The Okta team handles that. Don't need to worry about it." And off we went. It was great.
It actually makes so much sense, right? Because if you abstract identity out, I imagine, like you said, it gives you a lot more flexibility. It probably reduces the hesitance to build something new or try a new idea because you really can then build these micro experiences that you were talking about. So it's a really interesting approach. And in addition to some of the other things that you've already shared, if there was another CDO, another CIO who is looking to take this approach, what type of advice would you give them on how they think about identity-centric user design, or just essentially, building out a new digital strategy?
Yeah, and so you know, when you think about user-centric design, there's a lot of time and energy spent on personas, and there's a lot of energy spent on sort of user journeys, right? Sort of, Jason is buying a house. What does Jason want to do? How does he feel? And that sort of thing. And we've done that business for a while in the digital space. But when you add to that, what I think identity-centric design did for us is it allowed us to take those constructs, but then start layering in. My advice to another CDO would be layer in some other pieces, layer in privacy protections, layer in access to data, and start asking yourself questions like let's take the example that you just did, since you just put an offer on a house, right? So we definitely look at what do you want to know, what are you feeling right now, what are we going to want your digital experience to look like. But then as part of that identity design, if you then say, well, what information should Christy be allowed to have, and why does she need to have it, and what is she going to do with it? And so you start thinking about almost bringing the regulatory and the privacy framework into it, but you do it all around that identity. And what's nice about that is using that identity and then using characteristics of that identity, you can control that, right? So you can then say, again, going back to our business case, you're a buyer on a home. So you say, I'm Christy and I'm a buyer on 123 Any Street. Well, since you've designed your solution around what does Christy, the buyer, need to be able to see and not be able to see, you're able to sort of bake almost all the way abstracted into the identity, both the privacy protections and the data protections, if you will. And so my advice would be, don't just think about it in terms of user experience. Think about all the other aspects in that bucket of identity, because it's all about I'm servicing you, the customer, and I need to do so with the right information, with the right constraints and such, if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does to me at least, because if you think about going through these transactions, the concerns about privacy, the more data you have, the more informed a decision you can make. And so those aspects of data access and privacy and consent and all of that are part of what strengthens the experience, right? So I'll engage in something if it's trustworthy and it provides me information that's useful. So that's really only possible if you can verify who you're actually working with. So that's really really helpful advice, Jason. And now what does the future hold? What is next for InHere ID?
So for us, I'll tell you, we've got a couple exciting things that we're doing. So we're taking it to the next level, and then I'm going to share with you a dream I have. So right now, one of the things we are doing with it is we are working with several Okta partners who are in the business of even deepening identity verification, right? So now we're starting to look at taking um, uh, KYC type services and services that other third party companies provide that are integrated with Okta that would give us um, greater comfort around somebody, that it leaves us greater comfort that the email that you have is valid and that the phone number that you have is valid. But then combining that with a lot of the metadata that we now get out of Okta. And so a perfect example of that is when we talk about, let's use a real estate agent as a great example. So when you're a real estate agent, we need to know who you are. There are a lot of you. Sometimes you have a part-time job doing something else. You're on the go a lot, maybe not this last year, but prior to this last year, and hopefully next year, you're in your car a lot, you're driving around, you're visiting people, you're glad handing, you're doing a lot for your mobile phone. And so you're in some ways a security risk, right? Because you're kind of a constantly distracted user interacting with our services. But what's slick about what we can do with the InHere ID and with the data profiling information we get out of Okta, we're able to look at things like, what are your normal login patterns? What are the normal geographic patterns you log in from, right?
Mm.
What time of day do you normally log in? What types of activity do you have? So we can be a lot more comfortable and we can say, not only do we believe this is Christy logging in, but this is somebody who's always logs in at 9 o'clock every morning from the Starbucks using the Starbucks Wi-Fi because she gets her latte and then she gets in her car. And that gives us a lot more comfort that it's actually you, Christy, logging in, and not somebody from Eastern Ukraine trying to impersonate you just to get your commission check and such. So we're really starting to expand deeper the user behavior profiling that comes with Okta, and really just sort of fine tuning that experience as well as protecting ourselves. But the dream that I have, and I think if I'm right, I think you might have a slide here that might show my dream a little bit, that you can share with everybody. So what I really want to talk about, and we've kind of got two concentric circles here that I want to share with you. My dream is this idea of federated identity authority. So what I'm excited about is with Fidelity and with the scale, we have almost 40% market share in the real estate. So 4 out of every 10 transactions, we're going to be issuing an Okta ID to them. What I want to start talking about and what I think the future needs to be is, how do the other players that we play with, how do the large real estate brokers, how do the large mortgage companies that are interacting with us, how do they use Okta? How do they put identity in the cloud? And then how do we federate to one another? How do we reach out to them at the time of closing and say, I've got Christy logging into my system and this is what I know about her, and have them say, well, you know what? And we've got Christy who logged in and got her loan through us, and here's what we know about her. And how do we federate that identity between the two of us to get really comfortable before we disperse funds or hand over keys, that their identity and our identity have enough overlapping patterns that we are really comfortable you are who you are. So I'm really excited about, once your identity moves to the cloud, how do we then start federating identity with other business partners and look at those overlapping identity points till we really understand who people are, and then we can start doing some really cool stuff with digital, in my opinion.
For sure. That's when you really get into seamless
Exactly.
experiences, right? End to
Yep.
end. Yeah, that's really exciting future. Well, this has been incredible, Jason. I just really want to thank you for walking through where you've been, where you're going, and all of the, really candid advice and experience that you've had. Your passion comes across loud and clear, and is really inspirational about what you're doing at FNF. So thank you so much for the time, for sharing. And now we'll just stop and we'll take a check to see if there are any questions in the
Great.
chat.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.